What would you do if you discovered your family only loved you for your money? Richard Calloway had built an empire worth $3 billion over 40 years of relentless work. At 72 years old, he sat in his penthouse overlooking Manhattan, surrounded by luxury but drowning in loneliness. His 3 children, Marcus, Eleanor, and Victoria, rarely visited unless they needed something. His grandchildren didn't even know his favorite color. Tonight, as he reviewed his will with his lawyer, a devastating thought crossed his mind. Did anyone actually love him, or did they just love his bank account? The question haunted him so deeply that he couldn't sleep. By morning, Richard had made a decision that would change everything. He was going to test them in the most brutal way possible. He would pretend to lose everything and see who stayed by his side. What he discovered would shatter his heart into pieces. But it would also reveal one unexpected truth that made it all worthwhile. Richard called an emergency family meeting for Saturday evening at his estate. Marcus arrived first in his Mercedes, checking his Rolex impatiently. Elena came next, fresh from a spa appointment, her designer handbag worth more than most people's cars. Victoria was last, apologizing profusely while texting on her phone. They gathered in the dining room, where crystal chandeliers cast expensive shadows on marble floors. Richard sat at the head of the table, his hands folded, his expression grave. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. His children exchanged worried glances, sensing something was different about their father tonight. None of them could have predicted what was about to happen. Richard took a deep breath and dropped the bomb that would begin his cruel experiment. "I've lost everything," he said quietly, his voice trembling with manufactured desperation. The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus was the first to break the silence, his face turning pale. "What do you mean you lost everything? That's impossible." Richard explained how a series of bad investments had destroyed his fortune, how his business partners had betrayed him, how the market had crashed at the worst possible time. He spoke of frozen assets, bankruptcy lawyers, and creditors circling like sharks. His voice cracked with emotion as he described having to sell the estate, the cars, everything. Elena's perfectly manicured hand flew to her mouth in shock. Victoria dropped her phone onto the table with a loud clatter, but Richard watched their eyes carefully, searching for something he desperately hoped to find. Was it concern for him as a person, or panic about their inheritances? The answer became clear within seconds, and it cut deeper than any business loss ever could. Marcus stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "How could you let this happen?" Marcus shouted, his face turning red with anger. 40 years of building this empire and you threw it away on stupid risks." Eleanor joined in, her voice shrill and accusing. "What about us? What about our trust funds?" Victoria remained silent, but her expression spoke volumes. Betrayal, disappointment, calculation. Richard felt his heart sinking as he watched his children's true natures emerge. Not one of them asked if he was okay, if he needed emotional support. Nobody offered to help him through this crisis beyond money. They were already thinking about themselves, about their lifestyles, about their futures. Marcus paced the room like a caged animal, already planning his exit strategy. Elena pulled out her phone, probably texting her wealthy friends to secure her social position. Richard wanted to end the experiment right there, to tell them the truth, but he knew he had to see this through to understand the complete picture. The meeting ended in chaos, with his children leaving one by one without saying goodbye. Marcus stormed out first, his car tires screeching as he sped away from the estate. Elena left next, already on the phone with someone, her voice cold and businesslike. Victoria lingered for a moment, looking back at her father with an expression he couldn't quite read. Then she too disappeared into the night, leaving Richard alone in his enormous house. He sat in the darkness for hours, processing what had just happened. His loyal butler James, who had worked for the family for 30 years, brought him tea. "Rough night, sir?" James asked gently, the only person showing any concern. Richard nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. But the test had only just begun, and tomorrow would reveal even more painful truths. He needed to see how far their selfishness would go. The next week was a masterclass in human cruelty and disappointment. Marcus called exactly once to ask when Richard would be moving out of the estate. Elena sent a text message saying she couldn't visit because she was too stressed by the situation. Victoria simply stopped answering her phone altogether, as if her father had ceased to exist. Richard moved to a small rented apartment in a modest neighborhood, taking only essential belongings. He wore ordinary clothes instead of designer suits, drove a used car instead of a Bentley. He wanted to see if anyone would come looking for him, if anyone cared about his well-being. His phone stayed painfully silent, except for calls from creditors, actors he had hired to make the bankruptcy seem real. Each day without contact from his children felt like another knife in his back. But Richard persisted, documenting everything, noting every missed call he never received. His lawyer visited weekly to update him on the children's activities. What he learned made him physically ill. Marcus had immediately contacted lawyers to see if he could contest the bankruptcy and salvage any remaining assets. Elena had started selling family heirlooms that Richard had given her over the years, posting them online without hesitation. Victoria had told her friends that her father was an embarrassment and asked them not to mention him. The three siblings had even met for lunch together, without inviting Richard, to discuss damage control. They talked about changing their last name to distance themselves from the scandal. They discussed cutting all ties with their father to protect their own reputations. Richard listened to the recorded conversation that his investigator had obtained, and tears rolled down his weathered cheeks. These were the children he had sacrificed everything for, worked endless hours to provide opportunities. He had missed birthdays, anniversaries, and holidays to build wealth for their futures, and this was how they repaid his love, with abandonment, shame, and greed. But then something unexpected happened that would change everything. Richard was sitting in a small diner, eating a modest breakfast, when a young woman approached his table. She looked to be in her early 20s, wearing a server's uniform from the coffee shop next door. Her name tag read Sophie, and she had kind eyes that reminded him of his late wife. "Mr. Calloway?" she asked hesitantly, as if she couldn't believe it was really him. Richard looked up, confused, not recognizing her at first in his grief-stricken state. Then it hit him. This was Sophie Martinez, the daughter of his former driver who had passed away years ago. He had paid for her education through college, a fact he had almost forgotten. Sophie had heard about his financial troubles through mutual acquaintances and had been looking for him. She sat down across from him without invitation, her expression full of genuine concern. "I heard what happened," Sophie said softly, reaching across to touch his hand. "I'm so sorry you're going through this. Are you okay? Do you have somewhere to stay? Do you need help?" Richard was stunned into silence by her questions, the same questions his own children never asked. Sophie continued, explaining that she wanted to repay his kindness from years ago. She offered him a room in her small apartment, shared meals, whatever support she could provide. Her salary was modest, but she was willing to give whatever she had. Richard felt tears welling up again, but this time they weren't tears of pain. This young woman who owed him nothing was showing more love and compassion than his own blood. She didn't care about his money because she had never known him as a billionaire. She just knew him as the kind man who had helped her family in their darkest hour. Richard realized in that moment that he had been looking for love in the wrong places. Richard declined Sophie's generous offer, but was deeply moved by her kindness. They talked for hours about life, loss, and what truly matters in this world. Sophie shared how his investment in her education had changed her entire family's trajectory. Her younger brother was now in medical school. Her mother had a stable job. They had never forgotten his compassion and had always hoped to thank him properly. As Richard walked back to his apartment that evening, he felt something shift inside him. The experiment had revealed the worst in his children, but it had also shown him the best in humanity. He decided to continue the test for one more month, to give his children a chance to redeem themselves. But he also began making new plans for his future and his fortune. Plans that would shock everyone when the truth finally came out. Plans that would ensure his real legacy wasn't measured in dollars, but in the lives he had touched. The brutal revelation was still coming, but so was an unexpected redemption. 3 weeks into his experiment, Richard received his first phone call from one of his children. It was Victoria, and for a brief moment his heart soared with hope. Maybe she had come to her senses. Maybe she actually cared about her father's well-being. He answered on the second ring, trying to keep his voice steady and worn down. "Dad, I need to talk to you about something important," Victoria said, her tone serious. Richard held his breath, waiting for words of concern or love. Instead, what came next crushed whatever remaining hope he had held. "I'm getting married to Brandon Whitmore in 6 months, and I need you to understand something." Richard recognized the name. Brandon came from old money, a banking dynasty worth billions. Victoria continued without waiting for his response. "Brandon's family is very particular about image and reputation. We've decided it's best if you don't attend the wedding." The line went silent as Richard processed what he had just heard. His own daughter was uninviting him to her wedding because he was now an embarrassment. Victoria rushed to fill the silence with excuses and justifications about optics and family expectations. She claimed it was Brandon's parents who insisted, but Richard could hear the lie in her voice. This was her decision, made easier by his apparent poverty, but rooted in something deeper. She had always been the one he thought might be different, the sensitive one. Now he realized her sensitivity was only for herself, for how things affected her image. "I hope you understand, Dad. This is really hard for me too," Victoria said without a trace of irony. Richard wanted to scream, to tell her exactly what he thought of her cruelty, but he maintained his character, playing the broken father, accepting his new lowly status. "I understand," he whispered, though understanding and accepting were two very different things. Victoria seemed relieved and quickly ended the call, probably eager to return to her wedding planning. Richard sat staring at his phone for an hour afterward, completely numb. The investigators' next report brought even more disturbing news about Marcus. His eldest son had started a smear campaign against him in their business circles. Marcus was telling everyone that Richard had always been reckless, that his downfall was inevitable. He claimed to have always known his father would destroy the empire through poor judgment. Marcus was positioning himself as the smart one who had gotten out before the collapse. He was rewriting history, painting himself as the victim of Richard's incompetence. The betrayal went even deeper. Marcus had contacted Richard's former business partners, trying to buy company assets. He was literally trying to profit from his father's supposed ruin, picking at the carcass of the empire. Richard read the report 3 times, unable to believe his own son could be so calculating. This wasn't just abandonment or embarrassment. This was active exploitation and character assassination. Marcus had truly inherited Richard's business instincts, but none of his integrity or loyalty. Elena's behavior proved equally shocking in a different way. She had started a blog called Surviving Family Financial Disaster, where she painted herself as a victim. Her posts were filled with self-pity and humble brags about adjusting to a simpler lifestyle. She wrote about having to shop at regular stores instead of boutiques, as if this was some great tragedy. Thousands of followers sent her sympathy and support, completely fooled by her performance. She never once mentioned that she had millions in her own accounts from previous gifts. She never acknowledged her father's decades of generosity or her own privileged upbringing. Instead, Eleanor portrayed herself as a brave survivor, overcoming adversity caused by her father's failure. She had even started a GoFundMe page, claiming she needed help with basic expenses. The page had raised over $50,000 from strangers who believed her lies. Richard felt sick reading her carefully crafted posts that traded on his real pain for sympathy and cash. But Sophie continued to check on Richard regularly, bringing him homemade meals and companionship. She introduced him to her family, who welcomed him with open arms and genuine warmth. Her mother, Rosa, hugged him tightly and thanked him through tears for saving their family years ago. Her brother David showed him his medical school acceptance letter with pride and gratitude. These people who had so little gave him so much: respect, affection, and dignity. Richard found himself spending more time with Sophie's family than he ever had with his own. They played board games, shared stories, laughed together over simple dinners. Nobody cared that he was supposedly broke. They valued him as a person, as a friend. Sophie's grandmother even knitted him a scarf for the approaching winter, her hands arthritic but determined. Richard wore that scarf every day, treasuring it more than any expensive item he had ever owned. He began to understand what he had missed while building his empire: real human connection. One evening, Sophie asked Richard a question that cut straight to his heart. "Do your children know how lucky they are to have you as a father?" Richard couldn't answer, couldn't find words to explain the complicated truth. Sophie seemed to understand his silence and squeezed his hand gently. "My dad used to say that family isn't always blood. Sometimes it's the people who show up when everyone else walks away." Her words echoed in Richard's mind long after he returned to his small apartment. He realized that he had spent 40 years building wealth for people who didn't appreciate him. Meanwhile, one act of kindness to a struggling employee's family had created bonds stronger than blood. The contrast was stark and painful, but also illuminating. Richard began to see his bankruptcy not as a test he was conducting, but as a gift he had given himself. It had revealed truth he needed to see, no matter how much it hurt. The scales had fallen from his eyes, and he could finally see clearly who deserved his love and resources. As the month drew to a close, Richard arranged one final test for his children. He called each of them separately with a simple request. He needed someone to drive him to a medical appointment. Richard claimed he was having health issues, stress-related heart palpitations that needed examination. This was their chance to show basic human decency, to help their elderly father in a moment of vulnerability. Marcus said he had an important golf game and suggested Richard take an Uber. His own son recommended a ride-sharing app rather than spending 30 minutes helping him. Elena claimed she had a hair appointment she absolutely couldn't reschedule and offered to send money for a taxi. Victoria didn't even answer the phone, responding hours later with a text. "Can't, sorry. Busy with wedding stuff." None of them asked about his symptoms, whether he was scared or if the problem was serious. Their indifference was complete and absolute, no longer even masked by polite excuses. Richard sat alone in his apartment, the fake medical appointment on his calendar, feeling utterly abandoned. But then his phone rang. It was Sophie, who had somehow heard about his situation. "Mr. Calloway, I heard you need a ride tomorrow. What time should I pick you up?" Richard was stunned. He hadn't even called her, yet she had reached out. Sophie explained that she had called to check on him, and his neighbor mentioned the appointment. She had immediately rearranged her work schedule to be available for him. The next morning, Sophie arrived early with coffee and a cheerful smile that brightened the grey day. She drove him to the medical center, waited during the examination, and insisted on taking him to lunch afterward. She asked detailed questions about his health, took notes about his medications, and made him promise to call if he felt worse. Her genuine care and concern felt like sunlight after months of cold darkness. Richard almost broke down and told her the truth right there in the restaurant, but he maintained his composure, knowing the full revelation needed to wait just a little longer. Sophie had passed a test she didn't even know she was taking. That evening, Richard met with his lawyer to finalize the new version of his will. The changes were dramatic, shocking, and absolutely necessary given everything he had learned. His lawyer raised concerns about potential legal challenges from the children, but Richard was firm. Let them challenge it. The evidence speaks for itself. He had documented everything meticulously, the lack of phone calls, the cruel words, the exploitation. He had recordings, emails, text messages, and witness statements showing their true characters. But more importantly, he had months of evidence showing Sophie's kindness, generosity, and genuine concern. Richard's new will reflected not the family he had by blood, but the family he had found through adversity. His biological children would receive modest trust funds, enough to live comfortably but not luxuriously. The bulk of his fortune would go to establishing a foundation in his late wife's name, and Sophie would receive a substantial gift, along with the opportunity to run the foundation if she chose. Richard felt peace for the first time in months as he signed the documents. Now came the moment Richard had been both anticipating and dreading, the revelation. He scheduled a meeting at his lawyer's office, insisting all three children attend in person. Marcus, Elena, and Victoria arrived separately, their faces showing irritation at being summoned. They probably expected more bad news, more problems to deal with regarding their father's bankruptcy. Richard sat at the head of the conference table, looking older and more tired than before. His children barely made eye contact with him, checking their phones and sighing impatiently. The lawyer began by explaining that there had been some developments regarding Richard's financial situation. Marcus rolled his eyes. Elena examined her nails. Victoria stared out the window. Then the lawyer dropped the bombshell that would change everything. Your father was never actually bankrupt. His entire financial crisis was a test. The room erupted in confusion and anger as Richard watched his children's faces transform with shock, then rage, then terrible understanding. The brutal truth he had discovered was about to become their burden to carry. Marcus was the first to explode, slamming his fists on the conference table. You did what? This was all a sick game to you? His face turned purple with rage as he stood up, knocking his chair backward. Elena's mouth hung open in shock, her perfectly applied makeup unable to hide her pale complexion. Victoria started to cry, but Richard couldn't tell if the tears were genuine or another performance. How could you do this to us? Elena shrieked, finding her voice. Do you have any idea what we've been through? Richard almost laughed at the absurdity of her question. What they had been through. He had been through abandonment, rejection, and betrayal by the people he loved most. The lawyer began presenting the evidence, recordings, screenshots, documented instances of their cruelty and selfishness. Marcus tried to interrupt repeatedly, but the lawyer continued methodically through every damning piece of proof. Each revelation made the children squirm more uncomfortably in their seats as their actions were laid bare. You recorded us? You spied on your own children? Victoria accused through her tears. Richard finally spoke, his voice quiet, but carrying the weight of months of pain. I observed how my children treated their father when he had nothing to offer them. He explained how he had simply wanted to know if their love was real or transactional. The answer had been devastatingly clear. Not one of them had shown genuine concern for his well-being. Marcus tried to justify his behavior, claiming he was protecting his own family and that Richard should understand. Elena blamed stress and shock for her actions, insisting she had been planning to help eventually. Victoria claimed she had been respecting his space by not calling, a lie so transparent it hung in the air. Richard listened to their excuses with a heavy heart, hearing no real remorse or understanding. They were sorry they had been caught, sorry they had failed the test, but not sorry for their actual behavior. The difference was crucial and painful. Let me tell you what I learned during my months of poverty, Richard began, his voice steady. He described the loneliness of sitting in his apartment waiting for calls that never came. The pain of being uninvited to his own daughter's wedding because he was an embarrassment. The betrayal of discovering his son was trying to profit from his supposed downfall. The disgust of watching his daughter exploit his pain for social media sympathy and donations. Marcus tried to interrupt with explanations, but Richard raised his hand for silence. I'm not finished. I also learned who my real family is. He told them about Sophie, about her immediate concern and genuine kindness, about a young woman who had nothing but offered everything, while his children who had everything offered nothing. The comparison hung in the air like an accusation none of them could deny. Elena began crying harder, finally understanding the magnitude of their failure. But her tears felt hollow to Richard, too late and too self-centered. Richard pulled out copies of his new will and slid them across the table. "You each will receive $2 million in trust funds," he announced calmly. Marcus looked relieved for a split second until Richard continued. "The remaining $2.8 billion will go to charity and other beneficiaries." The room erupted again with protests and accusations. "You can't do this!" Marcus shouted, his face contorted with rage and greed. "We're your children. That money belongs to us." Eleanor joined in, her voice shrill. "This is insane! You're punishing us for being human!" Victoria sat silently, her expression cycling between shock, anger, and what might have been actual shame. Richard let them vent their fury, watching with detached sadness as they proved his point one final time. Even now, facing the consequences of their behavior, they could only think about the money. Not one of them apologized for how they had treated him. Not one of them acknowledged his pain or asked for genuine forgiveness. Their true characters were on full display, and it was uglier than he had imagined. $2 million is more than most people see in a lifetime, Richard said quietly. It's more than you deserve, given how you treated me. But I'm still your father. He explained that the trust funds would provide them comfortable lives if managed responsibly, but they would need to earn their own success rather than coasting on his legacy. Marcus's lawyer instincts kicked in, and he immediately started calculating legal challenges. "We'll contest this will. We'll prove you were mentally incompetent when you made these changes." Richard smiled sadly at his son's predictability. "Go ahead and try. I have psychiatric evaluations from 3 independent doctors confirming my complete mental competence." The lawyer added that any contest would likely fail and might result in the trust funds being reduced further. Richard watched his children realize they were trapped by their own actions. The empire he had built would not be theirs to inherit, and it was entirely their own fault. The realization was dawning on their faces, and it wasn't pretty. Elena suddenly changed tactics, her voice becoming soft and manipulative. "Daddy, please, we made mistakes, but we love you. Can't we start over?" Richard recognized the voice she had used as a child to get whatever she wanted. It had worked for decades, but not anymore. "You love what I can give you," Richard corrected gently. "That's not the same as loving me." He asked her directly, "When was the last time you asked about my life, my feelings, my dreams? When did you last spend time with me without wanting something?" Eleanor opened her mouth, but no answer came out. She couldn't remember, because it had never happened. Their entire relationship had been transactional. He gave, she took, and neither questioned the arrangement. Victoria spoke up for the first time in a while, her voice small. "What do we need to do to fix this?" Finally, a question that showed some self-awareness, but Richard shook his head sadly. "This isn't about fixing anything for a reward. This is about understanding what you've done and becoming better people." The lesson was more important than the money, though he doubted they would truly learn it. Richard stood up, preparing to leave his children with their thoughts and consequences. "I'm not doing this to be cruel. I'm doing this because I failed you as a father." His words surprised everyone in the room, including the lawyer. Richard explained that he had given them everything material, but nothing spiritual or moral. He had taught them that money solved all problems, and that success meant wealth accumulation. "I created monsters by shielding you from struggle, from having to earn anything, from understanding value." He took responsibility for his role in their character development, or lack thereof. But he also made clear that they were adults now, responsible for their own choices. The test had simply revealed what was already there. He hadn't created their cruelty, just exposed it. You can be angry with me, hate me even, but I hope eventually you'll understand what I'm trying to teach you." Marcus stormed out without another word, slamming the door so hard the walls shook. Elena followed, sobbing dramatically, already probably planning her next blog post. Victoria lingered, looking at her father with an unreadable expression. "Dad, I'm sorry," Victoria said quietly, and for the first time it sounded genuine. "Not sorry I got caught, but truly sorry for how I treated you. You deserved better." Richard felt a crack in the wall around his heart. Maybe not all was lost with his youngest child. They talked for 20 minutes after the others left, Victoria asking real questions and actually listening to the answers. She admitted she had been so focused on impressing Brandon's family that she lost sight of what mattered. She acknowledged how cruel the wedding invitation had been and how ashamed she felt. "Can I ask you something?" Victoria said hesitantly. "If I actually change, if I become a better person, would you consider walking me down the aisle?" Richard felt tears prick his eyes for the first time during this whole ordeal. "If you truly change, nothing would make me happier." They hugged, awkwardly at first, then tighter. It wasn't redemption yet, but it was a beginning. Richard left the meeting feeling a complex mixture of pain, relief, and cautious hope. The next day, Richard invited Sophie to lunch at an upscale restaurant downtown. She arrived looking nervous and underdressed among the wealthy clientele, but Richard greeted her warmly. "Sophie, I need to tell you the truth about something," he began, his heart pounding. He explained the entire experiment, his fake bankruptcy, the test, his children's failures. Sophie listened with wide eyes, processing this revelation about the man she thought she knew. "So you're not actually broke?" she asked slowly. Richard shook his head and explained his true financial situation. Sophie sat back in shock, looking at him with new eyes. "Did you test me too?" she asked, her voice small and hurt. Richard reached across the table to take her hand. "No, Sophie, you were the unexpected blessing in all of this darkness." He explained how she had restored his faith in humanity without even trying, how her kindness had been genuine because she had nothing to gain from it. Sophie's eyes filled with tears as she understood the depth of what Richard was saying. "I've made you a beneficiary in my will," Richard said gently, watching Sophie's face. "But more importantly, I'm establishing a foundation to help families like yours, hard-working people who just need a chance." He explained his vision: scholarships, emergency assistance, job training programs, all managed by someone who understood struggle. "I want you to run it, Sophie, if you're willing." Sophie started crying in earnest now, overwhelmed by the responsibility and trust. "Mr. Calloway, I don't know what to say. This is too much." Richard smiled, truly smiled, for the first time in months. "Say yes. Help me build something that matters more than money. Help me create a legacy of actually changing lives." Sophie nodded through her tears, unable to speak. They talked for hours about the foundation, about Richard's regrets and hopes, about what family really means. As Richard drove home that evening, he felt lighter than he had in years. The brutal truth had been revealed, casualties had been counted, but something beautiful was emerging from the ashes. The test had cost him his illusions, but given him something more valuable: clarity, purpose, and real connection. The news of Richard's resurrection spread through high society like wildfire within 48 hours. Business associates who had quietly distanced themselves suddenly called to congratulate him on his clever strategy. Friends who had stopped returning his calls now wanted lunch meetings to catch up. The hypocrisy was staggering but predictable, and Richard handled each interaction with polite detachment. He had learned exactly how shallow his social circle truly was. Meanwhile, Marcus had hired 3 different lawyers to explore options for contesting the will. Each lawyer delivered the same verdict: the case was airtight, and any challenge would be expensive and futile. Marcus refused to accept this, convinced that his father would eventually cave to pressure. He began a campaign of hostile voicemails and accusatory emails that Richard saved but didn't respond to. Elena's blog post about the test went viral, but not in the way she intended. Comments flooded in, calling her entitled and selfish, with many people praising Richard's experiment. Elena deleted the blog entirely within a week, humiliated by the public backlash. Victoria was the only one who reached out with genuine attempts at reconciliation. She came to Richard's estate, which he had moved back into, with a handwritten letter. In it she detailed her reflections on her behavior and her commitment to change. Richard read it carefully, looking for signs of manipulation, but finding what seemed like authentic remorse. "I called off the engagement," Victoria said quietly as they sat in the garden. Richard was shocked. Brandon Whitmore had been her dream match for 2 years. Victoria explained that Brandon's family had demanded she cut off all contact with Richard completely. "I realize that if I marry into a family that demands I abandon my father, I'm repeating the same mistake." She had chosen her father over wealth and social status, perhaps for the first time in her life. Richard felt hope bloom in his chest, cautious but real. They talked for hours, Victoria asking about the months of the experiment. She wanted to understand every detail of what he had experienced and felt. It was the longest real conversation they had ever had. "Can I ask why you chose Sophie for the foundation?" Victoria inquired without jealousy, just curiosity. Richard explained the full story, how Sophie's father had worked for him, how he had helped after the man's death, how Sophie had shown up during his darkest moment with nothing but kindness and concern. "She reminded me what real love looks like," Richard said softly. "It's not about what you can get from someone. It's about showing up when it's hard." Victoria nodded, understanding dawning in her eyes. "I want to volunteer for the foundation," she said suddenly. "Not for show, not to get back in your good graces, because I need to learn what you learned." Richard studied his daughter's face, searching for deception but finding only determination. "It won't be easy work, Victoria. You'll meet people with real problems, people who can't solve everything with money." Victoria met his gaze steadily. "I know. That's exactly what I need." Richard agreed to let her volunteer, with the condition that she answer directly to Sophie. If she could humble herself and learn from someone younger and less privileged, maybe there was hope. Marcus's reaction to Victoria's reconciliation with their father was predictably hostile. He sent her a scathing text, calling her a traitor and an opportunist. "You're just sucking up to get more money," his message read. Victoria showed it to Richard, who sighed deeply at his son's complete inability to understand genuine emotion. Marcus had become so consumed by greed that he couldn't recognize authentic change in others. He had also started spreading rumors in business circles that Richard was mentally unstable. The stories claimed the fake bankruptcy proved Richard was losing his grip on reality. Several of Richard's associates called to express concern, but most saw through Marcus's transparent attempts at manipulation. The rumors actually backfired, making Marcus look desperate and vindictive. Richard's lawyer sent Marcus a cease and desist letter, warning that continued defamation would result in legal action. Marcus responded by hiring a publicist to tell his side of the story to the media. Richard prepared himself for the public spectacle his son was about to create. The interview aired on a major news network, with Marcus portraying himself as a victim of parental cruelty. "My father psychologically tortured his own children for months," Marcus claimed with manufactured emotion. He described the trauma of believing his father was bankrupt, conveniently omitting how he had treated Richard during that time. The interviewer, who had done her research, asked pointed questions about his attempts to buy his father's assets. Marcus stumbled through non-answers, his polished facade cracking under scrutiny. She also asked about the recorded conversations showing his callousness and exploitation. Marcus claimed those recordings were taken out of context and possibly edited, accusations he couldn't prove. The interview became a disaster as viewers saw through his performance. Social media erupted with criticism, with most people siding with Richard's test. Hashtags like Bad Son Marcus and Team Richard trended for days. Marcus had wanted public sympathy but instead received public condemnation. The humiliation was complete and entirely self-inflicted. Elena took a different approach, disappearing from public view entirely. She deleted all social media accounts and declined interview requests. According to mutual acquaintances, she was seeing a therapist to work through family issues. Richard hoped this meant genuine self-reflection, but he remained skeptical. Elena had always been good at reinventing herself when an old image stopped working. He decided to give her space and time, not pushing for reconciliation, but leaving the door open. Meanwhile, the foundation work progressed rapidly. Sophie threw herself into planning with infectious enthusiasm and practical wisdom. She assembled a team of people who had experienced hardship themselves: former teachers, social workers, community organizers. Richard sat in on meetings, amazed by Sophie's natural leadership and empathy. She understood the people they were trying to help because she had been them. Her insights were invaluable, catching problems and opportunities Richard's wealth had blinded him to. Working with Sophie reminded Richard of his younger self, before success had complicated everything. Victoria's first day volunteering at the foundation was a wake-up call she desperately needed. Sophie assigned her to help process applications for emergency assistance, families facing eviction, medical crises, or job loss. Victoria read story after story of genuine struggle, and Richard watched her face change throughout the day. She cried over a single mother's application, explaining how she was choosing between cancer treatment and feeding her children. She got angry reading about a veteran denied benefits who was living in his car. By the end of the day, Victoria was emotionally exhausted, but transformed. "I had no idea," she whispered to Richard. "I've been so blind to how most people actually live." Richard put his arm around her shoulders, feeling proud of her for the first time in years. "Now you're starting to see what really matters," he said gently. Victoria returned the next day and the next, showing up consistently for the first time in her privileged life. Sophie became her mentor, patient but firm, expecting real work and genuine growth. 3 months after the revelation, Richard received an unexpected visitor, Elena. She arrived without announcement, looking different than he had ever seen her. No designer clothes, minimal makeup, her hair in a simple ponytail. "I'm not here to ask for anything," she began before Richard could speak. "I'm here to apologize and to tell you you were right about me." They sat in Richard's study, and Elena talked for 2 hours straight. She detailed her therapy sessions, her growing understanding of her narcissistic tendencies, her shame over the blog and GoFundMe scheme. "I returned all the money to those people," she said, showing him bank statements as proof, with interest and personal apology letters. Elena explained how she had gotten a real job, at a non-profit helping abuse survivors. She was working as an administrative assistant, earning modest pay and learning humility. "I'm not asking to be in your will or to run the foundation," Elena said firmly. "I just wanted you to know that I'm trying to become someone worthy of being your daughter." Richard felt tears rolling down his face as he embraced Elena for the first time in years. "Can I ask you something, Dad?" Elena said after they had both composed themselves. "What made you finally do the test? What was the breaking point?" Richard thought carefully about his answer. He described the night he had been reviewing his will, feeling lonely despite his wealth, the realization that his children only appeared when they wanted something. "I looked at my life and saw I had built an empire but lost my family somewhere along the way," Richard explained. "I needed to know if there was anything real left, or if I was just an ATM machine to you all." Elena nodded, absorbing his words. "We made you feel like an ATM machine," she acknowledged. "That's exactly what we did, and I'm so sorry." Richard appreciated her directness and lack of excuses. They talked about rebuilding their relationship slowly, with no shortcuts or grand gestures. Elena accepted that she would need to earn back his trust through consistent actions over time. As she left, Richard felt another crack in the wall around his heart, beginning to heal. Marcus remained the holdout, refusing all contact and continuing his legal threats. Richard received reports that his eldest son was struggling financially, having overextended himself on risky investments. The $2 million trust fund suddenly seemed very important to Marcus, but he refused to accept it while fighting for justice. His lawyers had advised him to take the money and move on, but pride kept him locked in battle. Richard felt sadness rather than anger toward Marcus. His son was so much like the worst parts of Richard's younger self, ambitious, ruthless, and unable to admit mistakes. Perhaps Marcus would eventually come around, or perhaps he would waste years fighting an unwinnable war. Richard couldn't force enlightenment on anyone, not even his own son. He focused instead on the relationships that were healing and the new family he was building. The foundation officially launched with a gala event where Sophie gave a speech that brought the entire room to tears. Victoria worked the event humbly, helping with coat check and cleanup without complaint. Elena attended as a regular guest, not seeking attention or special treatment. Richard looked around the room at the lives they were about to change and felt something he hadn't felt in decades: pure, uncomplicated joy. The brutal truth had nearly destroyed him, but it had also set him free. 6 months after the Foundation's launch, Richard received a letter that changed everything once again. It was from Marcus, handwritten on simple paper rather than his usual embossed stationery. The letter was different from his previous angry communications, raw, vulnerable, and surprisingly honest. Marcus wrote about hitting rock bottom financially after a series of failed investments. He described the humiliation of creditors calling, the fear of losing everything he had built independently. "I finally understand what you felt during those months," Marcus wrote. "The terror, the isolation, the wondering who really cares about you as a person." He admitted that his first instinct had been to call his father for help, then realized the bitter irony. Marcus wasn't asking for money in the letter. He was simply acknowledging that Richard had been right. The test had been necessary, and Marcus had failed it spectacularly. Richard read the letter 5 times, searching for manipulation, but finding only painful self-awareness. His son had finally learned the lesson, though it had taken his own downfall to understand. Richard didn't respond immediately, taking time to consider his approach carefully. He consulted with Sophie, who had become his trusted advisor on matters of the heart. "What does your gut tell you?" Sophie asked simply. Richard admitted he wanted to help Marcus, but feared enabling the same old patterns. Sophie suggested a meeting with conditions. Marcus would have to demonstrate genuine change, not just say the right words. Richard sent a response inviting Marcus to lunch with one rule: they would talk about everything except money. Marcus agreed, and they met at a modest diner rather than their usual expensive restaurants. The man who walked through the door looked like a shadow of the Marcus who had stormed out months ago. His clothes were off the rack, his expensive watch was gone, and most strikingly, his arrogance had disappeared. They sat across from each other in uncomfortable silence before Marcus spoke. "Dad, I'm sorry. Not sorry I got caught or sorry I need help. Sorry for who I was and how I treated you." The words hung between them, simple but profound. They talked for 3 hours, the longest real conversation Richard and Marcus had ever had. Marcus opened up about the pressure he had always felt as the eldest son, the expectation to be perfect, to take over the empire, to never show weakness. "I became what I thought you wanted, ruthless, focused on success at any cost," Marcus explained. Richard felt guilt wash over him, realizing how his own example had shaped his son's worst qualities. "I taught you that winning was everything," Richard admitted. "I showed you through my actions that money and power mattered most." They shared responsibility for the broken relationship, both acknowledging their parts. Marcus described his recent months of struggle, the panic attacks, the sleepless nights, the friends who vanished when his money did. "I met someone during this time," Marcus said quietly. "A woman named Jennifer, who's a school teacher. She has no idea about my family or my past wealth." Marcus's face softened when he talked about her, showing emotion Richard had rarely seen in his son. Jennifer had helped him through his crisis, asking nothing in return, loving him for who he was rather than what he had. "She sounds like my Sophie," Richard said with a knowing smile. Marcus nodded, understanding the parallel. "These amazing women showed up when we had nothing to offer but ourselves," Marcus reflected. "That's the real test, isn't it? Who stays when the money's gone?" Richard felt pride surge through him. His son finally understood. They discussed Marcus's future, and Richard was impressed by his son's new perspective. Marcus had started consulting for small businesses, using his skills to help entrepreneurs rather than exploiting them. His fees were modest, and sometimes he worked pro bono for companies he believed in. "I'm not making millions, but I'm making a difference," Marcus said, "and I'm happier than I've ever been." Richard saw authenticity in his son's eyes for the first time. This wasn't a performance or a manipulation. Marcus had genuinely transformed through his own trial by fire. "I want you to meet Jennifer," Marcus said hopefully, "and I want to meet Sophie properly, to thank her for helping my father when I abandoned him." Richard agreed, feeling the final wall around his heart beginning to crumble. The family dinner Richard arranged 2 weeks later was unlike any gathering they'd had before. Sophie arrived with her mother Rosa and brother David, nervous but excited. Victoria brought her new boyfriend, a humble architect named Tom, who came from a middle-class background. Eleanor came alone, still working on herself, but making visible progress. Marcus brought Jennifer, a warm woman with kind eyes, who clearly adored him for the right reasons. They gathered not at Richard's estate, but at Sophie's modest apartment, where she insisted on cooking for everyone. The cramped space and mismatched furniture felt more like home than Richard's mansion ever had. Rosa and Jennifer bonded immediately over teaching stories, their laughter filling the small kitchen. David and Tom discussed architecture and sustainable design with genuine enthusiasm. Victoria helped Sophie cook, taking instruction without ego, learning to make arroz con pollo from scratch. Elena set the table carefully, finding joy in the simple domestic task. Marcus and Richard stood on the small balcony, watching the sunset over the city. "Thank you for not giving up on me," Marcus said quietly. Richard put his hand on his son's shoulder, feeling connection he thought was lost forever. "Thank you for finding your way back," Richard replied. They stood in comfortable silence, two men who had both learned painful lessons about what truly matters. Inside, the group gathered around the small table, squeezing together and laughing at the tight quarters. Richard looked around at the faces, some related by blood, others by choice, all connected by genuine affection. Sophie stood to make a toast, her glass of simple wine raised high. "To family," she said with a bright smile. "Not the family we're born into, but the family we build through love, forgiveness, and showing up for each other." Everyone raised their glasses, and Richard felt tears streaming down his face. Victoria squeezed his hand on one side, Eleanor on the other. Marcus caught his eye across the table and nodded with understanding. This moment, in this cramped apartment, eating homemade food with people who truly loved him, this was worth more than his entire $3 billion empire. The foundation continued to grow, changing hundreds of lives in its first year. Sophie's leadership was transformative, her personal understanding of struggle making every decision meaningful. Victoria had worked her way up to program coordinator, earning the position through dedication rather than her last name. She had also reconnected with Brandon, who had broken free from his family's elitist expectations. They were engaged again, but this time for the right reasons, planning a small wedding where Richard would proudly walk her down the aisle. Elena had been promoted at her non-profit job and was writing a book about overcoming entitlement and finding purpose. She had asked Richard's permission to tell their story honestly, including her worst moments. Richard agreed, knowing that her journey might help other privileged people wake up to their own selfishness. Marcus had started a consulting business specifically for foundation grant recipients, helping them build sustainable enterprises. He worked closely with Sophie, their mutual respect evident in every interaction. Jennifer had embraced the family completely, bringing normalcy and groundedness to every gathering. On the anniversary of his fake bankruptcy, Richard gathered everyone for a special announcement. They met at the foundation headquarters, a renovated community center in a neighborhood that needed hope. Richard stood before the group, his biological children, his chosen family, and the foundation team. 1 year ago, I conducted an experiment that nearly destroyed my family, he began. I pretended to lose everything to discover who truly loved me. The results were brutal and heartbreaking. He paused, looking at Marcus, Eleanor, and Victoria. My children failed that test spectacularly. They showed me their worst selves, and I showed them mine by setting up the test at all. Richard acknowledged his own manipulation and the pain he had caused. But something beautiful emerged from that darkness. We found truth, and truth created the opportunity for real change. He announced that he was modifying his will again. The foundation would still receive the bulk of his estate, but his children's trust funds were being increased, not because they deserved more money, but because they had earned back his trust through genuine transformation. Marcus, you lost everything and found yourself, Richard said, looking at his son with pride. You learned that success isn't measured in dollars, but in positive impact and authentic relationships. Marcus wiped tears from his eyes, nodding. Elena, you faced your narcissism and chose the painful path of genuine self-improvement. You're becoming someone who gives rather than takes. Elena smiled through her own tears, mouthing, "Thank you," silently. Victoria, you sacrificed social status and a prestigious marriage to stand by me when it mattered. Then you worked harder than you ever had to earn your place here. Victoria stood and hugged her father tightly. But beyond my children, Richard continued, I found something I didn't expect. Sophie, you showed me that family isn't about blood or obligation. It's about showing up, caring genuinely, and expecting nothing in return. Sophie was crying openly now, surrounded by her mother and brother. You all taught me that my real legacy isn't the money I accumulated. It's the lives I touch, the love I give, and the truth I'm brave enough to face. The room erupted in applause, not for the money, but for the journey they had all taken together. Richard concluded his speech with one final revelation that surprised everyone. I'm stepping down as head of the foundation. Sophie has proven herself a better leader than I could ever be. Sophie started to protest, but Richard raised his hand gently. I'm not disappearing. I'll stay on the board as an advisor. But this foundation needs someone who understands struggle, who leads with empathy, and who can't be corrupted by wealth because she knows what really matters. He announced that Marcus would become the foundation's financial director, using his reform skills for good. Victoria would oversee programs, and Elena would handle communications and fundraising. We're all working together now, using our different strengths to build something meaningful, Richard explained. The family business was no longer about accumulating billions. It was about distributing resources to create opportunity. As the meeting ended and people mingled, Richard stepped outside for air. He looked up at the sky, thinking about his late wife who had died before seeing any of this transformation. I finally figured it out, he whispered to her memory. The brutal truth was exactly what we all needed. And for the first time in 40 years, Richard Calloway felt truly, completely at peace with his life and his legacy. 2 years after the test, the Calloway Foundation had become a beacon of hope across multiple cities. Sophie led with quiet authority, her decisions always rooted in empathy and practicality. The organization had helped over 5,000 families, providing scholarships, emergency housing, job training, and micro-loans that created lasting change. Richard watched from the boardroom, prouder than he had ever been of any business deal. Marcus managed finances with integrity, turning modest donations into sustainable programs. Victoria ran daily operations with passion, her privileged background now fueling her commitment to equity. Elena's communications work brought national attention and increased funding without exaggeration or manipulation. The siblings worked seamlessly together, their past conflicts forging unbreakable bonds. Sophie often joked that Richard's bankruptcy had been the best investment he ever made. Donors flocked to events, drawn by the authentic redemption story that unfolded publicly. Richard spoke at conferences worldwide, sharing his experiment as a cautionary tale about entitlement and the true meaning of family. Victoria's wedding day arrived under perfect spring skies, a simple outdoor ceremony in the Foundation's community garden. Richard walked her down the aisle, his arm steady through hers, both beaming with genuine joy. Brandon stood at the altar, transformed from the entitled heir Richard had once met. He had left his family's banking firm to start a social impact investment company. The guests were a mix of Foundation beneficiaries, Sophie's family, and a few old friends who had proven loyal. No celebrity performers, no ostentatious displays, just heartfelt vows and laughter among people who truly knew each other. Elena served as maid of honor, her speech honest and funny about their family's rocky journey. Marcus gave the father of the bride toast, poking gentle fun at his own past greed while celebrating Victoria's growth. Sophie sat with Richard, her hand in his, both teary-eyed during the couple's first dance. As fireworks lit the evening sky, modest ones funded by Foundation kids, the family gathered for photos that captured more than poses. They captured healing. Marcus and Jennifer announced their pregnancy at the wedding reception, met with cheers that shook the tent. Richard hugged his son tightly, whispering, "Congratulations, Grandpa-to-be," with a grin. Marcus laughed, the sound free of his old tension. Jennifer, glowing and gracious, thanked Richard for giving Marcus the chance to become the man she loved. The Foundation staff presented the couple with a custom cradle, handcrafted by program graduates learning woodworking skills. Rosa, Sophie's mother, pulled Richard aside to share that David had graduated medical school, top of his class, now paying forward his scholarship by treating underserved communities. Every success story circled back to Richard's painful decision, proving its wisdom. As the night wound down, Richard reflected on how his brutal truth had multiplied into countless acts of kindness. He sipped sparkling water, his doctor had insisted on moderation, and felt healthier at 74 than he had at 60. The empire he once chased seemed like a distant dream, replaced by something far richer. Elena finished her book, From Heir to Human, Breaking the Entitlement Cycle, which became a surprise bestseller. Publishers approached her after reading her Foundation newsletter articles, but she insisted on authenticity over sensationalism. The book detailed her failures during the test, her therapy journey, and practical steps for privileged people to develop empathy. Richard wrote the foreword, praising her courage in exposing family wounds publicly. It sold widely in Silicon Valley and Wall Street, sparking corporate diversity training programs. Elena donated all royalties to the Foundation, creating an endowment for mental health services. At book signings, she always credited Sophie as her real teacher in humility. Young professionals approached her in tears, sharing how the book helped them reconnect with estranged parents. Elena's transformation inspired a podcast series interviewing other recovery stories from wealth. Richard attended her first major reading, sitting in the back row anonymously until called on stage. Her hug conveyed years of earned forgiveness and mutual pride. Sophie and Richard's relationship deepened naturally, surprising no one who knew them. They traveled together to Foundation projects, rural clinics, urban job centers, international partnerships. Richard proposed during a trip to Costa Rica, helping build a school with local families. On hands blistered from volunteer labor, he offered a simple gold band engraved with "Family Found." Sophie accepted with laughter and tears, saying yes to the man, not the billionaire. Their wedding was Foundation funded, held at the community center where it all began. Rosa walked Sophie down the aisle. Marcus officiated with sincere words about second chances. The children embraced Sophie fully, calling her the sister they needed. Richard danced with Victoria, then Eleanor, then watched Marcus twirl Jennifer's baby bump. Sophie cut the cake, a recipe from Rosa passed down generations, with Richard's steady hand over hers. Photos showed not wealth, but warmth, the real currency they all valued now. Their honeymoon doubled as site visits, blending love with purpose seamlessly. Richard faced his first major health scare, a heart episode linked to decades of stress. Marcus drove him to the hospital, calm and capable, while Victoria coordinated with doctors. Elena handled media inquiries discreetly. Sophie never left his bedside. Tests revealed blockages from years of high-stakes living, but early detection saved him. Post-surgery, Richard woke to his entire extended family in the waiting room. Sophie held his hand, whispering gratitude for more time together. David, now Dr. Martinez, consulted on his care, bridging professional and personal worlds beautifully. Recovery meant lifestyle changes, walks in the park, home-cooked meals, daily foundation check-ins. Richard embraced it, finding joy in slowness after lifelong rushing. Marcus took over more board duties. Sophie managed operations flawlessly. The scare reminded everyone of life's fragility, strengthening their bonds further. Richard emerged leaner, wiser, prioritizing presence over possessions daily. The foundation celebrated its 5th anniversary with a gala unlike any before. Beneficiaries shared stages with donors, telling paired stories of impact. A single mother Richard once helped now ran her own business. Her son, scholarship recipient, introduced her proudly. Veterans housed by the foundation performed music they composed in therapy programs. High school graduates credited job training for their college acceptances. Sophie moderated panels where past test failures, like Elena, discussed growth mindsets. Richard keynoted, revealing never-before-shared details of his loneliness pre-test. He showed old photos, empty mansions, absent family holidays, contrasted with current joyful chaos. "I traded billions for this," he said, gesturing to the diverse crowd. Standing ovation lasted minutes. Even skeptical journalists wiped tears. Coverage called it the Redemption Empire, focusing on human transformation over dollars. That night, Richard realized his true wealth: lives uplifted, family restored, purpose fulfilled beyond measure. No, paragraph 58. Marcus's consulting firm grew into a national network, specializing in ethical business scaling for social enterprises. He mentored foundation startups, taking equity only in proven successes. Jennifer homeschooled their 2 children part-time while teaching public school, balancing family and impact. They lived modestly in a foundation-renovated home, hosting weekly dinners for the extended family. Marcus often reflected on his pre-test arrogance, using it to connect with struggling entrepreneurs. "I was you, chasing wrong metrics," he'd say. His TED Talk on failing forward from privilege garnered millions of views. Richard attended every major client launch, beaming like a proud father at graduations. Jennifer's patience grounded Marcus. Their marriage modeled quiet strength. The couple volunteered weekends at shelters, teaching financial literacy to those society overlooked. Marcus finally accepted. Legacy through lifting others surpassed any inherited fortune. Victoria and Brandon's Social Impact Fund invested in women-led startups, yielding strong returns while creating jobs. Their 3 children attended foundation summer camps, learning service from age 5. Victoria authored policy papers influencing urban renewal laws. She spoke at universities about privilege as platform, not entitlement. Family vacations mixed service trips with relaxation, building wells in Africa, then beach downtime. Richard babysat often, delighting in unscripted grandchild chaos. Brandon bonded with him over chess, discussing ethical capitalism late nights. Victoria's journey from wedding uninvitation to family anchor inspired her TEDx talk. The couple donated wedding gifts to endow childcare at foundation sites. Every milestone circled back to the test's brutal lesson, now their family's origin story told with gratitude. At 78, Richard reflected from his porch swing, Sophie beside him, grandchildren playing nearby. The empire sold long ago funded perpetual good. His net worth mattered less than lives touched. Children thrived independently, calling weekly with real updates, not requests. Foundation impacted 50,000 souls, numbers climbing yearly. He penned memoirs dictated to Elena, titled Bankrupt in Fortune, Rich in Truth. Final pages urged readers, test relationships honestly, prioritize love over legacy, forgive but verify change. Sophie squeezed his hand. Worth the heartbreak? Richard smiled, kissing her forehead. The brutal discovery freed us all. Best decision ever. Grandkids piled on for hugs. Laughter echoed. As sun set on Manhattan skyline, once his lonely kingdom, Richard felt complete. The test shattered illusions but built unbreakable reality. Family redefined, purpose eternal, love proven genuine. Fade to legacy lived daily.